On this sheet that you see in front of you right now, this represents the important concepts for week 7 for the plants. These are the things that I think that you should know in order to have a complete understanding of this unit. So I'm going to talk about some of these, but only to emphasize what's in the PowerPoint already. So for the most part, if you wanted to, you could ignore this video lesson and move on. I don't necessarily encourage you to ignore me, but I do like to talk. So let's begin. Plant kingdom characteristics. So we just finished diversity of life. And in the diversity of life, we talked about several kingdoms. We talked about all the kingdoms except for plants. So plants is the only one left for us to talk about. In the plant kingdom, we have this as our characteristics. So notice this is different from all the other kingdoms. What do plants have that the other ones don't? Well, they're eukaryotic. That's true of the fungi, protists, and animals as well. They are photosynthetic, which you find to some extent in the bacteria kingdom. They exhibit alternation of generations, which we saw in the fungus kingdom. They develop from embryos, which we've seen in the animal kingdom. Okay? And they are photosynthetic, containing chlorophyll A and B, which I already mentioned, but I want to specifically point at the fact that they contain these two major photosynthetic pigments, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. So these are the major characteristics of our plants, differentiating them from the other kingdoms. You should know that. Okay. Now, when we're looking at plants, plants started in the water, just like animals. And over a period of millions of years, the plants have made the move from water to land. And as we look at the 11 phyla that you are supposed to know, there's evolutionary milestones that allowed them to move from water to land. So if we start with water, here's my water, water, and I have this plant. So if you have a plant in the water, so really what does it need? In order for the plant to be successful in the water, what it needs is water and access to sunlight. Once it has those two, it's okay, right? It should be able to get all the other things that it needs in order to survive. So the simplest of our plants, we call them these non-vascular plants, right? Non-vascular. So our non-vascular plants are very small, they're flat, they don't need to worry about moving water around because they're in water, and they represent a very particular group of plants. In the non-vascular group of plants, we have three phyla that we look at: the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. Oh, I forgot my moss. So when we do see these plants growing on land, they're going to grow in very wet environments. So they typically tend to be swampy or like that, like a wetland. And so those plants are not going to grow very tall. So when you do see these plants on land, for the most part, when you look at them, for us, when you look at a human and an animal, we represent the diploid version of the cycle. The only haploid part of our cycle are our sperm and our eggs, nothing else. But imagine a sperm or an egg just landing on the ground and then growing. And then an adult sperm, we'll call it, and the adult egg moving around, finding each other, and then producing an offspring. Well, with these non-vascular plants, the major life cycle is the gametophyte. It's a haploid. So when you look at a moss, the odds are you're looking at the version of the sperm or the version of the egg. The major plant that you see is the gametophyte or the haploid version. And then if you look at the life cycle of these, you'll see that they will produce a sporophyte or diploid, but that is less significant. Okay? So if you want to move from water onto land, you need some special adaptations. And typically when you get onto land, the water is a little harder to get. So wetlands is water everywhere, but when you start moving away from the wetlands, and you move to a place that's a little bit more dry, the water is a little bit more challenging. So there'll be water around still. It'll still be kind of wet. So these plants here, we're going to call them our seedless vascular. And these seedless vascular plants, what they have is they have special tissue inside the plant that's able to bring the water up. And because the water is able to move from wherever the water source is further up, these plants here, we call them seedless, which we haven't got to, vascular. So seedless vascular plants, they're able to grow taller than your non-vascular because they have these special tubes or vascular tissue that move the plant's water up from the water source. They can grow taller. Okay? As we keep on moving to, so these plants, they're more advanced. So a classic example of this would be a fern. But they still need water. The reason why they need water is because these plants drop sperm. And the sperm is going to move from one of these plants to another plant. So they require water in order to reproduce. So therefore they require water. As we leave the water and go more terrestrial, so it's even drier, we get into the seed plants. Okay, so the seed plants. There's still water, of course, but the water is, a little bit more distant, a little further down. And so these plants here, they're going to have to grow something in order to get down to where that water is. And so these plants here on land, they tend to be quite tall. They can be this shorter than a seedless vascular, but they tend to be quite tall. And they include things like pine and fir and roses and whatnot. And so these seed plants, we call them seeded vascular, come in two varieties. One of them we call them naked seeds, gymnosperms. And so the seed is just a seed. There's nothing around it. And so we associate these with conifers. Right? Kind of like the Christmas tree. And as we get even more advanced, we get into these special trees that have flowers. I'm a terrible drawer, so I'm not even going to try bothering. But these special trees will have flowers on them. And we call these angiosperms. And they represent the flowering plants. And I said trees, but I mean plants. So flowering plants. So here is the evolution of our plants. We go from non-vascular in the water. They don't need a lot of support. They don't need to grow very tall. To kind of terrestrial, kind of water-based. They're moving water up these vascular tubes so they can be a little bit taller, but they still require water. The seeded vascular, which are able to move completely onto land. Of course, all plants need water, so they have roots that will go down to the water and pull the water up. They have seeds, and these seeds will not have anything around them to protect them, and you recognize these as conifers, and there's other ones. And then we get to the mammals of the plant world, the flowering plants. And so these have flowers, and then when their seeds develop, they have a fleshy fruit typically around them. We call them a fruit, and that's a very significant feature of these angiosperms. So when you guys are looking at the plant taxonomy, this is the evolution. This is something I consider important. That's why I'm talking about it. The evolution of moving from water to flowering plants. That's important. Okay? And as we look at I'm just going to scroll up here, move up. As we look at the different phyla, and you'll see this on the PowerPoint, we have 1, 2, 3 non-vascular. I'll highlight it here. 3 non-vascular. And in the vascular, we have the pterophyta, which are our ferns. We have the Lycophyta, which are our club mosses. And then we get into the seeded plants, right? So non-vascular, right? Seedless vascular. And then we have our gymnosperms, right? So our gymnosperms are represented by these 4 different phyla. And then we have this last one here, our flowering plants, our angiosperms. There's one that's missing. So which one's missing? And I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to see if you guys can figure it out, but I will tell you that you do know. And in the share from the Flipgrid last week, a couple of students actually used this as their interesting organism. Okay? So that's the plant kingdom characteristics, the evolution of water to land, and taxonomy. When we get to the angiosperms, there are 2 major groups of angiosperms. There are more than 2, but there's 2 major groups, monocots and dicots. So make sure you go through the PowerPoint and you get an understanding of the differences between the monocots and dicots. Why is this significant? Why am I talking about it? In your various different kingdoms, you have organisms that have specialized tissue, specialized cells. In the grade 12 course, one of the things that we focus on is the metabolism of plants and how they are able to produce energy. And in order to understand that, you need to understand the structure of the leaf. So let's go over here. So you have an X. When we get to the plants, the plant tissue is important. So we have, at the top, we have cells that represent the upper and lower margins of our leaf. Protecting the plant, we have this thing, I'm going to use green here, the cuticle, right? And this cuticle is always found on the top and sometimes found on the bottom. And it protects the plant, it prevents it from losing moisture and all sorts of things. So under these upper and lower tissues, known as the epidermis, not to be confused with the epithelio, which we find in animal cells, we have the important cell known as the mesophyll. And the mesophyll, this is where the majority of the magic happens in the plant. This is where you find the chloroplast, and other important organelles. So the mesophyll, this is something that we will come back to in grade 12. So this is where the majority of the plant's functions occur. So when we look at a plant, there are several important types of tissue. There is the epidermal tissue, which is, outside. There is the ground tissue, which is pretty much everything that's not epidermis and vascular tissue. And then, of course, there's the vascular tissue. So within the leaf, within the stem, within the root, there is vascular tissue. And so this vascular tissue, what it does is it will carry the water from the root into the various parts of the plant, and it will carry the sap, which is the sugar, the result of photosynthesis, from the photosynthetic regions, the leaf, let's say, down throughout the plant. So this vascular tissue conducts liquid, water. The mesophyll is the ground tissue, pretty much everything that is not epidermis and vascular tissue. Okay? So when we look at the leaf, at the bottom, there's these special openings. And these special openings, what they do is they allow the gas that's required for photosynthesis in, and that gas is carbon dioxide. And it also allows the release of oxygen. So oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is required for photosynthesis. And they come in these very special openings down here. These very special openings are called stomata. So stomata are the openings, and the stomata are characterized by very specific cells right here called guard cells. So these guard cells will open and close. It's kind of like your iris and your pupil. Your iris and your pupil. The pupil is a hole in your eye. The iris is what controls the size of it. These guard cells, they will open and close, and they'll make the stomata open, or they'll make the stomata close. And if it's open, in comes carbon dioxide, out goes oxygen. If it's closed, nothing goes in or out. The other thing that can escape here as well is water. And so that's a concern. And that's something we'll talk about in grade 12, what the concern is. As water leaves the plant, see, right? So let's say the water leaves the plant here. And now I'm teaching this in not the same order as the PowerPoint. So if you follow the PowerPoint will structure this lesson so that you can make a note of this. I'm just trying to connect everything together. As the water leaves the plant to the stomata, water is very sticky. It likes to stick to each other. You'll probably notice that. That's why certain insects can walk on it. That's why water sticks inside, glassware and straws. So there's a thing called the capillary effect. So water is very cohesive. So as the water comes out here, it's stuck to the water behind it, which is in this vascular tissue. And so as the water leaves out this stomata, it's going to pull the water through this tube, right? And this tube is made up of very specialized tissue. This tissue includes things called xylem and phloem. Right? So phloem is the one I'm going to focus on here. Phloem is where the water is being pulled up from the root. So as this water is being pulled from this tube in the leaf and going out the stomata, something needs to fill up this water here. And since it's so sticky, it pulls water up from the stem. And the water from the stem pulls water up from the root, which pulls water in from outside. So what happens is when this water evaporates outside the stomata off the leaf, it causes water from the root to be pulled up into the stem, to be pulled up into the leaf, to be pulled out. And so this is how a plant is able to move water from the ground up its stem and out. Imagine you had to carry water from the first floor outside Suzuki up to third floor in a bucket. That's a lot of work. Plants do that same thing, except they go more than 3 stories, some of them go up many more stories. How do they do this? Do this process known as transpiration. So transpiration is where water evaporates from the leaf and then the water fills in from behind so that the plant is able to get water moving, whether or not it's up a dandelion or whether or not it's up a sequoia or a redwood. It's the same process. Transpiration. Some places will call it evapotranspiration, but it's really the same thing. It's just an additional word to describe what's happening. When sap moves down, that's called translocation, and you can learn that from the PowerPoint. So the specialized tissue that you should know includes the mesophyll, which is responsible for photosynthesis. We talk more about that in grade 12. The epidermis, and of course the vascular tissue, which is made up of the xylem and the phloem. The phloem goes up, the xylem goes down. Okay? So make sure you learn that in the PowerPoint. As you go through the PowerPoint, you'll also see that there's very specific roles that the plant has, right? So plants evolve all sorts of strategies in order for them to be successful. One of the major learnings from this lesson, that's really grade 11, and you haven't seen this before, is around the hormones. So in grade 12, we talk about animal hormones and how we release insulin and glucagon and so on. In grade 11, we talk about the plant hormones. So there are factors that affect the plant growth, and those factors that affect plant growth is a major learning for this unit, for this section. The plant unit is actually a whole unit, but we're pretty much putting it into a single week. So here are the factors that affect plant growth. Some of these you've seen from grade 9, right? And this part here on growth regulators, these are the hormones that determine whether or not a plant is going to grow, germinate, flower, lose its leaves, produce fruit. and if it's going to move towards sun, if it's going to move towards gravity. These are all controlled by hormones. Some of these you can buy from a greenhouse, Canadian Tire, and we use them in order to help our plants fruit. When you pick an apple, you don't want it to be ripe because it will bruise very easily. So we pick them unripe, and when they arrive at the stores, or just before they get delivered to the stores, they'll spray them with a particular hormone that will cause it to ripen. So we use hormones all the time artificially to make the plants do what we will. Okay, so you'll get all that information from the PowerPoint. I encourage you to read through that. I'm asking that you know what at least one hormone does and at least one plant movement, whether that's a nastic movement or a tropism. Know at least one. Okay, so the last part of this is so around me I have a bunch of plants. And I'm going to share with you some of the look of that plant. You'll have to do the research, but some of the look of that plant. The ZZ plant. If you're going off to university, which many of you might be doing in a couple of years, then this is the plant you want. If you want to look like you know what you're doing with the plants with minimal care, give it a little bit of light, give it a little bit of water, but let's say you forget to water it occasionally, this plant will do well. So the ZZ plant is an excellent plant for this. And I have one right here. So what you're doing with this activity is you're looking at so I can see myself. Okay. You're looking at these plants and you're going to tell me their taxonomy and what special adaptations do these plants have that allow them to be successful. So ZZ plant's a great plant. A small one here, well, it's a medium-sized one here. I'm not sure you can see the larger one that I have. It's actually the parent of all the small plants I have in the house. I'm just going to move my camera around. And that's a large ZZ plant over here. Okay, so they can grow quite large. The prickly pear. So I already touched my prickly pear Saturday earlier this morning. And so now I'm going to have these little spikes inside of me for like the next week. But here is the prickly pear. So the prickly pear is a type of cacti. You'll see this one setting up a nice little growth here. It's got some evil looking defensive mechanisms on here to protect it from being eaten. I encourage you to Google camel eating prickly pear because that gets me every time. That's a prickly pear. Mother of thousands, a kalanchoe. So the reason why I have this particular plant up as a demonstration is because it is a great plant to demonstrate propagation. So if you want to produce a new plant, we know that we can use it from seed. But this plant here, what it will do is, see if I can get it close enough. I'll send some pictures up so you can see them as well. Try to autofocus it on here. Autofocus. So on the leaves, it has little tiny plants. Can you see them? So on the margin of the leaves, there's these plants. And these plants focus it again. So if I want to get a new kalanchoe, I can't focus it very well. I can just take one of those tiny little leaf plants that are growing and just put it in the ground. So this one plant, it just drops hundreds of these. They're called mother of thousands. And you can figure out why, because each one of these will drop and then it'll produce a new plant that will produce more plants and so on. If we're in class, I'd give each of you one of these and ask you to grow it and see what happens, right? Because it just produces so many. So this is a form of asexual reproduction, right? It doesn't require seed and pollen. It's just able to basically clone itself and drop a new plant. Right? So propagation, there's many plants that we can propagate from, and this is one of the more popular ones. Right? Next is a pitcher plant. So my pitcher plant, unfortunately, it doesn't have any pictures on it, so I can't show you the pitcher plant. I can show you the pitcher plant, but there's no pictures on it. Let me see if I can zoom in on it. You can see it there. There's not really much to look at. It's pretty far away. but there's no pictures on it, which are really quite remarkable. So I might ask you just to Google pitcher plant, and then you can get a better feel for what that plant looks like. But it's it's a plant. It's called an insectivorous plant. It actually eats insects. Large pitcher plants will eat small amphibians too. Aloe vera. So look at this aloe vera. Aloe vera's, my anecdote for this aloe vera is my mom, she has this garden and she had tons of aloe veras growing outside of it. And I saw this aloe vera, and I like aloe vera. So I took one of the plants and I brought it home, and I nursed it and I watched it grow, and it was doing so well in this one window that it actually flowered. I don't know if you've ever seen an aloe vera flower. And so it started flowering, and the thing about aloes though is once they flower, they die. They spend all their energy in this flower. The flower, you can watch it grow overnight. So in one night, it will grow 1, 2, 3, 4 centimeters. And at the end of the flower growth, it'll flower and then dies. But aloes propagate readily. And so in many cases, depending on where you are, it's almost like a weed. So I know you can't really see the aloe very well. I picked this one in particular because it is just a whole bunch of, it's one aloe plant that's basically propagated itself and produced this weed environment. So depending on where you are, if you're not happy with your aloes, my mom actually weeded them out of her garden, you'll end up with aloe after aloe after aloe after aloe. And there's many different species as well. Some have broad, thick, some are thinner leaves, and so on. Sphagnum moss, I didn't bring up here. The golden pothos, many of you have this at home. I've seen some people with some pretty remarkable examples of this plant that grow all around their house as like an ivy, and they have very interesting stories as well. But this is a very popular plant. It's hardy. They grow in water. They grow on land. They send out these little adventitious roots you'll see in the PowerPoint. They'll do proper roots. They're a very versatile plant. The Gr11Wk7. Okay, so that is, what plant was that one? That is the moss ball. So I have a moss ball somewhere. I scoot around looking for the bottle. So this is a moss ball, right? It's moss. And so the moss ball, I have it in my turtle tank personally, and does a really good job of helping to keep some of the nitrates in the turtle tank down. But it's a ball of moss, right? They grow in these large green balls. So that's interesting. And coral cactus. So this is a plant that doesn't exist in nature, the coral cactus. The coral cactus is not coral, which is an animal, and it's not a cactus. It is two different plants. The stem is one plant, and this flower part is another plant. It's not a flower, but it kind of looks like a flower. It's that time of year where the flowers are just starting to come up on the plant. But the coral cactus represents a graft between two plants. A very popular graft at this time of year is a hibiscus. A lot of people take a hibiscus shrub or flower and put it onto a tree. And so they have this kind of a tree version of a hibiscus, and that's a very common grafted plant. That's a graft, coral cactus. And sago palm. So here's a sago palm. So what's special about this? Why am each of these plants I'm giving you a picture of, they all have something very special about them, some kind of special adaptation, some evolutionary adaptation, some interesting taxonomy. Notice the leaves and what they look like. Notice this bulb that's here. It's not a bulb. Notice this growth structure that's here and how that looks. Any one of these that you want to see more detail during the live meet, let me know and I will pull it out and you can see. I'm going to throw a picture. The Rose of Jericho is a very interesting plant as well. So here is the Rose of Jericho. And this is a Rose of Jericho that's been not in water for a very long time. But I took another one that was just like it and I put it in water this morning just so you can see what happens. So this is a plant that lives in the desert. And so the moment it gets water, it doesn't waste any time. So I put it in water, and you can see that it went from this to this, which is already starting to open up. And I'm going to leave it like this. I'm going to grow this week, and we're going to see what happens. So each day I'm going to take a shot. This will be my daily observation plant, the Rose of Jericho. Right? So you can see that already, after being in the water for 15 minutes, there's been a major change. Fern is another plant that I wanted you guys to take a look at. Every year, this is another anecdote. Every year I buy one of these, and this is going to be the year that it's going to grow. It's going to be awesome, and then, I don't know, I'm not a very good fern grower, and it ends up having this, and look at all the leaves on here, the special fern fronds we have on here. Every single one of these ends up dropping all over our floor, and it ends up being a big mess. But the fern plant, also very interesting. So what do you notice about its evolutionary adaptations? I kind of talked about it as a specific example of a kind of a plant a little bit earlier in this lesson. The jade plant. I mentioned the jade plant already, so you guys saw that. Jade plant, it has special adaptations that allow it to be more successful in the niche that it lives in. This is a larger jade plant, but many of you probably might have a smaller one at home. Yucca gigantica. Here it is right here. Yucca gigantica. There it is. Let's see. Let's just focus in on it. Yucca gigantica. So I'm in a situation, yeah, there's someone walking in the background there, that's okay. So this is a yucca plant. So there's something special going on here. It's a very common household plant. So what is going on with this big giant plant here? Why am I choosing this one as one of the plants I want you to learn about its evolutionary adaptations? Green algae. I didn't go and collect any from outside, but it is something that you all probably seen at some point on a pond or a creek or some kind of body of water. And this last one I want to show you, because I just, might as well show you a big plant here. It is bird of paradise. So it's a little harder because I'm trying to show you these plants on the same camera I'm talking on. This kind of thing's in the way, so I'll just reel this in here. Alright. There, the bird of paradise. So there's a big plant. So what special adaptations does this bird of paradise, it's called the white bird of paradise, what special adaptations does this plant have that allow it to be so successful in its natural environment? So I've shown you probably 10, 11, 12 plants here, and each of them have something uniquely special, some kind of adaptation that allows it to be successful in its particular niche. So when you get to that worksheet that says evolution, I can't remember what the name is called, evolutionary adaptations or something like that, the same one you see on the screen here. So you pick 1, 2, 3, whatever number you'd like, and tell me what's so special about that plant. Give me the taxonomy, use Wolfram Alpha, and then tell me the adaptations on that plant that allow it to be successful for the niche that it happens to live in. All right.